In times of conflict, it is not uncommon for ships to be lost with all hands, torpedoed or hit by air attack, well outside the range of any friendly rescue. Destroyers were the most common victim of this on both sides of the Pacific War. However, cruisers were not immune to it. While rare for a cruiser to go down with all hands, there were cases where most of the crew was lost. USS Juno is, sadly, one such case. Her story is a well-known one, due in large part to 5 particular victims. Well known or not, it is still a story worth covering. I will, in this video, cover her sinking, as well as the effect it had on one Gilbert Hoover's career. Beginning, of course, with the sinking itself. First, it is important to understand that USS Juno was already a crippled ship. During the chaotic naval battle of Guadalcanal, in the early morning hours of November 13, 1942, Juno was hit with a Japanese torpedo. The deadly long lance did its job, blowing a massive hole in her side. This buckled her deck, might well have broken her keel, and left her limping along on one screw. Juno was slow and could barely turn. Her weapons were largely out of action, and she had no way to defend herself from underwater attack. For all of that, however, by the time the sun rose, the cruiser was still afloat. Crippled, yes, but still moving under her own power. As a result, Juno was able to join up with other ships. The badly damaged San Francisco, a handful of destroyers, and the nearly undamaged USS Helena. It was difficult for Juno to keep pace with them, although her crew managed. While the cruiser sailed along with the other American ships, the men aboard her did their best to patch up the damage. There were limits to what they could do, naturally, but the ship wasn't at real risk of sinking. Not even when she was down a dozen feet on her bow. By the time Juno was hit a second time, these efforts had actually succeeded in pumping out most of the water. Neptune's Inferno claims that Juno was only 4 feet down on the bow, not a dozen feet, and that she was capable of a sprightly 17 knots. It was during this process that some of her medical detachment were transferred to help on San Francisco. These men, Lieutenant Roger O'Neill in particular, were unhappy about being pulled off their own ship. Considering what was about to happen, one can say they were fortunate, even lucky to have been pulled off their ship. As the American formation struggled to safer waters, they were being stalked from beneath the waves. As the sun climbed towards noon, a Japanese submarine set up an attack run. This was the I-26, a submarine that had already torpedoed USS Saratoga. Here, the Japanese submarine fired a spread of torpedoes at USS San Francisco, the largest ship in the formation, and one that was facing her own troubles with battle damage. This was the logical target in all regards. The biggest, the most valuable, and the one having the most difficulty. Though there's some disputing sources on exactly how many torpedoes were fired. Some sources will say 2, some will say 3, while a lookout on San Francisco apparently spotted 4 wakes. Regardless of how many were launched, all but one would end up missing entirely. All of them missed their intended target in the form of San Francisco. One of the torpedoes missed a second time when it narrowly sailed past Juno's stern. However, a final torpedo, while missing San Francisco, slammed into Juno instead. This torpedo, while smaller than a destroyer long lance, was still deadly in its own right. Not least because it hit in almost the exact same spot that Juno had previously been torpedoed. Whatever protection she had from torpedoes in that area was already compromised. This led to an almost immediate explosion. An explosion of her magazines that was so violent, the cruiser sank within 30 seconds. This explosion, catastrophic as it was, convinced many onlookers that no one could have survived. The signalman aboard Helena, as an example, saw his opposite number on Juno thrown over 30 feet into the air by the force of the explosion. Moreover, pieces of debris as heavy as entire 5-inch gun mounts were lobbed skyward. One such mount fell within 100 yards of USS Fletcher's stern. It is entirely possible that this mount is the one Petrel found resting in the mud decades later. For his part, Lieutenant O'Neill's report states that a piece of debris from Juno slammed into San Francisco's No. 1 gun turret, and it did it with enough force to put a gun out of action. All that being said, it was at this point that things get a bit divisive. While many were convinced there were no survivors, this was wrong. In fact, it is possible that survivors were seen in the water, and this was just lost in the shuffle and general chaos. While we'll never have an exact number, for obvious reasons, the generally accepted number of survivors is around 100. With a crew of around 700 men, this is actually a large portion of survivors, especially considering how violent Juno's end really was. These men would end up floating in the water, slowly dwindling in numbers, for a week. From November 13th, 1942, until November 20th. This was a sad fate for those men, and one that could have been avoided, or at the least mitigated. This isn't to say a good portion of them wouldn't have died, regardless, wounded to varying degrees that led to them drowning or dying of their wounds. Quite a few, however, were as healthy as could be expected after the violent sinking. These men could have been saved had rescue arrived sooner, which it should have had it not been for a series of events that almost read like a tragic comedy. I will note something up front before I cover that, however. Gilbert Hoover, the captain of USS Helena, was almost certainly a scapegoat here. He would be removed from command in the aftermath of Juno's sinking, based on not sticking around to rescue survivors. The first thing to keep in mind here is that Hoover had no real way to engage I-26. USS Helena was undamaged, but she didn't carry depth charges, so Hoover's flagship was useless here, at least as a means of hunting submarines. The same went for San Francisco, even if she weren't at constant risk of sinking. That left the destroyers. Hoover had gathered 3 such ships to his little squadron, of varying capabilities. USS O'Bannon's sonar was out, which meant she could only engage a submarine on the guidance of another ship. And at the time, she wasn't even with the group. O'Bannon had been detached from the formation to send a radio message, and wasn't due back until the middle of the afternoon. Then there was USS Sterett, which had functional sonar, but not much else. Her depth charges had been jettisoned during the battle to prevent them from going off. Moreover, the destroyer was damaged to the point of steering with her engines, which is hardly ideal for hunting a submarine that didn't want to be found. That just left Fletcher largely untouched and fully combat capable. However, that was just one destroyer, and to detach her to hunt a clearly skillful submarine, well, that would have left the formation defenseless in an area that was known to be a hunting ground for submarines. Over the course of the retreat to safety, multiple sightings of submarines would occur. Whether these were real sightings or false reports is immaterial to the argument in this case. There was a very real chance of submarine attack after Juno sank, and Hoover had little recourse to deal with that. With this in mind, the captain made the painful decision to leave the area. Hoover had to prioritize the battered ships in his squadron, and couldn't risk submarine or air attack. Either could have led to even worse losses than had already been suffered. Couple that with the belief that few could have survived the explosion, and Hoover's choice here makes sense. He needed to protect San Francisco and Sterett, not to mention keep Helena undamaged. To stick around was to invite further attack, when he lacked options to counteract such attacks. This is not to say that Hoover did nothing for the men in the water. A B-17 arrived soon after the sinking to provide air cover. While Hoover was unwilling to break radio silence, he still had Helena flash a signal to the plane. This signal contained news of Juno's fate and her approximate sinking location. The aircraft received the message and would put it in a report upon landing. For whatever reason, this report didn't get passed on quickly enough to matter, either through slow decoding or just the fog of war. This is the first of multiple missed chances to rescue Juno's survivors. Or the second, depending on how one views Hoover pressing on instead of stopping. The next mischance would come after Helena and her wrecked comrades reached safety. Arriving in the New Hebrides by November 14th, Hoover notified his superiors about Juno's fate. Records indicate at this point that higher command knew about Juno by November 14th as a result. A destroyer, the USS Meade, was promptly ordered to search for survivors. That same destroyer would be forced to detour multiple times instead of going right to the task. First for a shore bombardment, then to attack Japanese transports on the 15th, in addition to rescuing the crew of a downed aircraft and 2 other sunken destroyers, the latter of which saw her pull some 266 men from the water who might otherwise have suffered a similar fate to Juno's survivors. This would delay her until November 16, 1942, at which point Meade, low on fuel, had to cut off her search after a day of hard looking. Aircraft would continue the effort, eventually tracking down survivors on November 18th. Another destroyer, the old USS Ballard, was sent to pick up these survivors. Ballard would ultimately pull 2 men from rafts, with a PBY Catalina finding 5 more. 3 further survivors made it ashore, where they would eventually be rescued. Only 10 men in all, plus the 4 that had gone aboard San Francisco before Juno's sinking. One of these survivors in the water, who didn't make it to rescue, might have been George Sullivan, the eldest of the Sullivan Brothers. 2 of the brothers almost certainly died in the initial sinking. 2 more might have made it into the water, only to die shortly after. That left George, who might have survived for some time. If he did, it was as a man who kept calling out to his dead brothers, before finally succumbing to his grief and exhaustion, stripping down to, quote, take a bath, and entering the water, swimming off from other survivors, where a shark ended his suffering. Honestly, even had George survived, I don't want to think about how he would have felt and the survivor's guilt he would have suffered. That being said, through all this process, Hoover was being torn a metaphorical new one by Admiral Halsey. His valid arguments about the danger of the area and his lack of ability to protect his ships were torn apart. Even words of support from Admiral Nimitz himself did not save Hoover. Halsey had decided he was the one to blame for Juno survivors being lost and removed him from command. Exactly what happened here is a matter of debate, not helped by Halsey changing his story at multiple points. Was it entirely his decision to remove Hoover? Was it something pushed by his staff? Or was it some mix of the two? No one really knows. For what it's worth, one of Helena's crew, Ben Cochran, said that Halsey's chief of staff was a driving force in Hoover's sacking. Apparently Miles Browning, the chief in question, outright bragged about getting Hoover removed from command. Or so Cochran's story goes. Regardless, Halsey would later state regret for the entire affair. You can decide if he was genuine in that or not for yourself, but it doesn't matter in the end. Hoover was removed from Helena, and one of the most talented cruiser captains in the fleet, who had gotten his ship through 2 hectic night battles with no real damage, was taken off active service. I do tend to think that things have roped around a bit hard towards knocking Halsey down in the modern day. But in this case, it's really hard to see this as anything but a mistake. Hoover could have stuck around or detached Fletcher or any number of other things. But any of those choices could have led to an even greater tragedy very easily. One can argue that they wouldn't have, and that more of Juno's crew could have survived. But in the moment, with mostly damaged ships and only 1 ship to defend his formation with, Hoover made his choice. He chose to keep Helena and her crippled companions safe. Juno's sinking was a tragedy. The loss of her survivors an even greater tragedy. However, their fate was a confluence of factors, and blaming Captain Hoover for not stopping is ignoring the various other mistakes in the process. Mistakes that would ultimately see dozens of men die who might have been saved. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.